everyone, and welcome to the latest instalment of the Mandarin Talks. My name is Melissa Coade. I'm Canberra's news editor for the Mandarin, and I will be hosting our conversation with you today. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the various lands upon which we're all broadcasting to you from today. In my case, that's the land of the Ngunnawal people. So today we will be talking about all things VPS and the conditions, political and operational, in which the government employees of Victoria are working under. I think it might be fair to say, even before we've kicked off our conversation, that it's not an enviable position. That said, times like this, times of high stress and pressure, are also often characterised as times of opportunity. And I'd love to explore some of those ideas in a meaningful way and not in a puff piece way with our guests today. So to dive right in, please let me introduce our guests, CPSU Victorian Branch Secretary Jiselle Hanna, and RMIT Emeritus Professor of Public Policy and Social Economy. He's been knocking around the traps looking at the work of government in Victoria for a while, David Hayward. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
In the context of, I guess, what we could call the wider macro climate of Victoria, this is where we're at. 5 years ago, Australia was hit by the COVID pandemic. Victoria copped the brunt of that with a legitimate response to keep citizens safe amidst a public health emergency. But today we're left with the cost of the decisions made back then. There's a cost of living crisis, which is walloping everyone in Australia, but particularly the state of Victoria. We often hear public administrators talk about doing their work in what's called a VUCA context, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity landscape, and doing that amid a series of, again, a term they often use, cascading crises. We have a state election just over a year away that will be held next year on the 28th of November, 2026. And then, of course, something that has been widely discussed and is starting to get a bit more pointy now, the Silver Review, which is an independent review that former Mandarin Helen Silver has been commissioned to undertake. The government integrated or took some steps towards the recommendations of that approach, I understand, around about the time of the state budget. But there is news also that Cabinet may have already looked at the response to that and it will be released in the coming weeks. So keeping in mind that the Silver Review's mission is to bring the VPS back towards its pre-pandemic share of employment, I thought maybe, Jiselle, we could start with you. What do you know about the review and what are your members telling you about where we're at so far?
We know about as much of the review that everybody else knows. I think the government is keen to keep it that way. But the reality is we understand that there are job cuts and there have been job cuts for the last 4 years. The Victorian Public Service has been decimated every year in the lead up to the next state election. And that was a matter of government policy, a 10% reduction in the public service every year leading up to the election. This isn't new. I don't think the Silver Review is going to give us any further insights on that. It'll likely be further cuts and it'll likely be this spurious claim of bringing the public service back into its pre-COVID numbers. I find that a very strange justification. The world is different post-COVID. This idea, this arbitrary period of time that we want to take Victoria back to is nonsensical. A more sensible approach is to look at the reality of Victoria today and what kind of public service do we need to resource Victorians, to support Victorians, to build infrastructure, to provide the services. That should be the question in front of the Victorian government today, and the answer for that needs to be fit for purpose.
Yeah, so let's get into that a bit. Of course, the Silver Review, and no government these days worth their salt who want to stay in government would make cuts to essential frontline services, or what they refer to as the essential frontline services, such as health, education, policing. But what we did see at the time of the state budget were 3 key measures taken. So the government said they'd made corporate savings from non-frontline functions across government, and this included things like increasing automation of activities and services, making better use of tech, tracking procurement spending. In your mind, are those improvements, which sound good and meritorious, going to be enough to make the savings they're talking about?
I first want to challenge the idea that frontline services haven't been targeted. That's the first thing. That's not true. So we just need to get that one out of our minds. Parent line was closed down. That's a frontline service. The Victorian Fisheries was half their frontline enforcement officers. So the idea that frontline services are not being cut, just simply incorrect. We should stop saying that. The second piece of that is the distinction between frontline and backroom is also very arbitrary. You actually need the infrastructure behind frontline services to maintain frontline services. So I wouldn't argue that that in itself is also a logical way to break up how you're going to realise funding savings. In relation to the meritoriousness of where the cuts are, I mean, and where the government is trying to realise savings, our overall response is that the budgetary recovery project that the government is embarking on, which we understand that they need to realise some budgetary savings. All of that is a function and a question of government priority. So the choice to cut public service jobs is political. There are other ways to realise budgetary savings without cutting jobs. So there are a broad range of meritorious ways to bring the budget back into line without having to cut jobs.
So there are a few interesting ideas that maybe I'd like David to help reflect on. So the first, David, being that there's a popular saying in government, which is that if you're in power, anything is possible, but not everything. And I love that way of thinking about budgets because, as Jiselle says, it's a question of choices. And because you can choose anything, the question for government about what choices or priorities you make, that's a political one. It's a political calculation. You need to be able to pick things that you know your voting public will have a tolerance for being wound back or cut. Do you think it's enough for the Silver Review's, I guess, ultimate implementation to be looking at questions of consolidating duplicative functions in government, or will to deliver on its mission, will it actually have to make some cuts, which is something that Jiselle is a bit more sceptical of?
It's a tricky set of questions, Melissa, because we really know very little about the Silver Review. The one page that's up on the website doesn't tell you a lot, and it's meant to be focusing on the public service, but the public service only makes up a small fraction of the total public sector. And so it doesn't give you very much detail. This is well behind schedule. Was all finished in July, as I understand it. We still haven't heard a word. There was meant to be, I think, $600 million of savings baked into the current budget. But hey, guess what? During the year, things have turned out better than they expected. So the budget is running probably about $1 billion better than they thought last May. Maybe they've changed their mind. Because in the background, one of the things that was sort of hinted at, I think, by Jiselle was that back in 2023-24, the then Treasurer, Tim Pallas, said in train sort of $500 or $600 million a year of savings that are still working through the system. The Auditor General's been trying to track, have those savings been realised? And they're not exactly sure. They can't say front office or back office. They were given budget envelopes that they had, the secretaries were given budget envelopes that they had to meet. That's all been working in the background. They've gone quiet on the Silver Review. Maybe they're not going to do anything at all, because when it comes to tough decisions, this government doesn't seem to be really keen to make them.
Can I stay on you, David? And again, picking up on something Jiselle said, during the Australian federal election and the US presidential election, the language around cutting glut in the public service became quite populist. more perhaps than I've heard in my voting lifetime. And I'm among the elder millennials, so, you know, pre-John Howard is sort of hazy for me. But we heard this increasing language about what kind of bureaucrat or what kind of public servant was wasteful and was, I guess, can be dispensed with. Do you think there is a rigorous or comprehensive understanding within the community about the importance and different roles of bureaucrats? Because if we talk about spending and wasteful spending, competent people who can manage procurement are just as critical to how well the taxpayer dollar is spent as someone on a 200K plus a year salary.
Yeah, look, again, it's interesting looking back at research over a long period of time. When people are asked about the public service, they tend not to have a very good view of this thing called the public service, and they don't like waste. Who likes waste? But if you say, would you like to see fewer teachers? They say, no, 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 no. Would you like to see fewer police people? No, 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 no. Would you like to see fewer doctors or help? No, 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 no. So the more that people can relate to the activity, the less likely they're going to see it as being wasteful. Now, the one thing that sort of upsets the apple cart is if there's some sort of general belief that there's a budget crisis that could be linked to an economic crisis, they'll accept those kind of cuts. Now, one of the remarkable things in Victoria over the last 3 or 4 years, the right and the financial press has been going, Victoria is headed for disaster because its budget's so bad. And I mean, they haven't minced words. The Financial Review has been just appalling in its coverage in many ways. Guess what? That crisis hasn't happened. In fact, Victoria's been ticking along quite nicely on all the measures, been doing really well, probably because of all of the spending linked to the debts and the deficits that are keeping the economy going. That's what makes it a bit unusual right now. Things feel okay in Victoria in an economic sense. There's other questions that are now popping up around crime, but to deal with crime needs more spending. There's questions popping up around infrastructure. Do we need the expensive suburban rail that looks popular? So it's an interesting mix as we move forward into the next election cycle, only a year away. And guess what happens today? The Shadow Treasurer falls for a trap. Government says, hey, hang on, we've looked at all your tax cuts you're promising. They add up to 10 billion. How are you going to afford that? She says, no, 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 you've got it wrong. It's only 5 billion. You know, when they're trying to paint a picture of a budget crisis, oh my goodness, why would you say that? So Victoria is in a very unsettled, awkward period at the moment with all those questions being unsettled, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out as we move forward into the next election cycle.
Before I throw to Jiselle, I want to ask you one more question, which is, to what extent does the health or strength of the opposition in Victoria play into what we're talking about? Is it the kind of operating environment where you can have a sort of healthy political contest of ideas about where to make those savings and where they will be most impactful for the community, or are we sort of beyond that point in Victoria with a Labor government that's been in power for so long?
Who are you directing that to? Sorry, you're directing that to David or to me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Melissa. I thought you were throwing that to Jiselle. That's why I was quiet. Would you mind just briefly saying that again?
I'll ask it again. Well, to what extent do you think the dynamic of the Victorian political landscape is playing into how these conversations and decisions are being managed about where best to make the cuts and investment? Does this
look,
otherwise?
It's a great question. Look, it's a great question. Normally, you would have expected to be front and centre, quite frankly, but the opposition is in disarray. They're still dealing with issues of leadership. They clearly hate one another. They're quite happy to go on the front page of the newspaper and run each other down. There's court cases going on. They're a debacle, quite frankly. So Labor has been given a pretty free run. But are they doing a really good job with that free run? No, they also do not look well organised. Today, the Premier announced new planning changes, which are going to go down like a lead balloon. They're effectively removing Victorians' right to be notified if there's going to be a new dwelling next door or a change to the dwelling next door. They won't even be notified. You'll just wake up in the morning and there'll be a demolition truck there. You'll think, what's going on? These are going to be very unpopular changes. So we seem to have what has become quite an unpopular Victorian government facing opposition in disarray. And so the questions that you'd be expecting to occupy the headlines right now as we move into the next election aren't being there. And look, today, in terms of this whole issue of the silver review, if the opposition is proposing $1 billion a year of tax cuts, and they're saying that we've got a budget crisis, that does imply humongous cuts to the public service. They're falling for a big trap, because remember, in 2023-24, there's $2 billion of taxes which are legislated to stop. They were implemented as part of the deficit reduction plan in 2023-24, only for 10 years. The budget would be a mess. So I don't know how it's going to play, because I don't think I've ever seen Victorian politics in such a state, quite frankly.
Jiselle, you've made the point to me previously that we can wax lyrical about cutting the public service, but you also need to remember they are citizens of Victoria and they are part of the economy, and firing public servants is like firing a voter also. And you mentioned before trying to find a balance in terms of the numbers of employees on the government purse string that is fit for purpose. What is, in your view, a more constructive way of arriving at that answer, if not the silver?
I mean, I think there's a piece that goes before that question, which is the actual value and hidden costs, I think, associated with job cuts. So this idea that you can cut jobs and then what you're doing is you're saving the salary and the on costs associated with that employee, and you realize all of the savings associated with that is also not true. So when you cut public service jobs, you're not just cutting that person and their wage and the on-costs associated with their wage. You're also losing organisational memory. You're losing depth of experience. That isn't automatically replaceable, and it's not like the government doesn't need that. Where do those people go? They go into the private sector. How does the government realise that expertise and skills? They pay more for it by way of private contracts and private consultants. This is the bit that doesn't get spoken about when we're talking about private public sector cuts. In fact, you lose approximately 40 cents in every dollar that you think you're saving in relation to job cuts. So that equation doesn't work. And I think it's important that Victoria actually understands that when we're looking at cuts. The other thing is, there are multiple examples where areas have been cut, where we've gone out to tender only to realise that we, being Victoria, need to have this service once again within the public service. So we've offered redundancy packages, we've paid out all this money in these cuts. Those people have gone off and they've come back in. We've re-established that. You only had to see the announcannouncement today about reopening Malmesbury Youth Justice Centre to see this pattern that happens in relation to job cuts. So Malmesbury was closed in 2023. It's about to open again in 2026. There's every chance those workers that were retrenched that got packages may very well be re-employed. It's not only parts of the public service that make headlines where this is the occurrence. So I want to make that piece really clear as well. Cutting jobs isn't just like squaring the ledger. There is a lot behind it that gets lost in that too. And now that I've given you that background context, I've actually forgotten your question. So if you could just repeat that so I can complete the thread.
Yeah, it was that it's simple enough to say we need to cut spending to public service salaries by revising the numbers down, but that also has wider implications for all those people who otherwise would be employed by the government.
Yeah. I mean, look, our team did a little bit analysis on the cost of effectively rendering people unemployed, especially in higher age brackets. And so, I mean, there are broader costs associated with cuts in the public service, unemployment, social costs, etc. Yeah, I mean, but the government also has that data and that analysis in front of them as well. I guess our main point is there are multiple ways that we can realise budgetary savings that aren't through this particular method of brutal job cuts. And it has been demonstrated time and time again that the government needs those services and re-employs those people back in. This idea of a growing public service and shrinking and growing over 10, 15, 20, 30 years. It's a really inefficient way and short-sighted way to run government and public services. And Victoria doesn't benefit from that.
Yeah. So in terms of how we cut the cookie, I guess, there are some questions which have come through, Jiselle, which might be directly relevant to you. I'll just read 3 and you can sort of answer them as you see fit. First question, what do we do if we're issued a Clause 11? Second question, how do we know where those job cuts will be made if they happen? Which departments? Is there still opacity around that? What role of the union, or what is the union's role in this if that were to happen? What protections exist?
All right, so so what does a Clause 11 mean? Firstly, the CPSU oversees 54 agreements. Clause 11 is in the main, or what we call the core agreement, that covers the VPS departmental staff, staff across prisons, etc. And in that agreement, Clause 11 relates to the obligation to consult in relation to a major change. In the WorkSafe one, it's Clause 21, etc. So what we hear as Clause 11 is code for redundancies. That's probably why that language came through the Q&A the way that it did. But it's a different clause in all of the different agreements. If you are issued with a Clause 11, that is a notice and an invitation to consult. What we're saying as the union, and firstly, you should all join the union. Your biggest protection is being in the union and standing side by side with others, and it's through our collective power that we have the strength to fight back. We have made a decision, the union has made a decision to engage in good faith in these Clause 11 consultations. Now, if we end up with egg on our face at the end of that, that's that. But we've undertaken to engage in the consultation in good faith. If you're issued with a Clause 11, the first thing you need to do is call a workplace meeting, call us, and we'll have a discussion about what's in the proposal. There is an opportunity, and there are some timelines around it, to write alternative proposals. So heads of department will say, we'll take a particular workplace. There are 75 workers here. We're going to consolidate 20 roles into 15 roles. We're going to kind of move other roles out altogether, and we're going to get rid of a certain number of roles. You get to say in an alternative, and the Clause 11 needs to outline the rationale, the explanation behind why the proposal is being made. And so you get to write back and you say, actually, you can realise this same intention by getting rid of these executives who are really, quite frankly, overpaid and don't do a lot of work, and retain this number of people in the VPS front line of that particular business unit. You lodge all of those alternative proposals by the deadline. We have an opportunity under Clause 13, by the way, of the head agreement, the VPS head agreement, to lodge a dispute. We can lodge a dispute for a range of reasons. One is we don't believe that the consultation is genuinely in good faith. And in some cases, we've heard some pretty horrific tales of managers saying, oh, this Clause 11 is an opportunity for us to get rid of the personalities we don't like. And in some of those cases, we've stopped or had an indefinite pause on the Clause 11 process entirely. So if you get Clause 11, call a workplace meeting, call the union, we'll come out and we'll meet with you and we'll engage in good faith. But as David said, department heads have been issued with budgetary targets that they need to meet. This is not an individual department problem. And if we fight them individually like that, we will lose. The CPSU is running a broader campaign targeted at government called Victoria Works because we do. And it does precisely what David pointed to earlier. The reason it is can seem like a popular thing to do to cut public sector jobs is mostly Victorians don't know what public servants do. And if they knew, they would absolutely not be in favour of that service, or in whatever way they are the beneficiaries of the work that Victorians do, they wouldn't agree to get rid of that function. And it should be the job of government to promote and elevate the role of public servants. But in the absence of that, that's what the union will do. The only reason this state runs is because public servants are doing their job. All the way from the railways, the signs that you see in state parks, all of that, a public servant did all of that. Staffing telephone call centres, issuing you with the forms that you need, renewing your licences. These are all the functions of Victorian public servants. And the role of Victoria Works, because we do, is to elevate the standing of public servants in the minds of Victorians.
Thanks, Jiselle. So I'm going to read a question for you to think about, and then I'll come back to you and I'll put another question to David. This one. I've heard suggestions the Silver Review is more about large organisational or structural changes, given the budget reprioritisations presently happening across the VPS, seem mainly targeting staff at level 6 and below. Has anyone heard similar? So I'll just let Jiselle think about that, and then I will ask and put this question to David. What are some tangible examples of how a Victorian public servant can realise benefits through budgetary savings, if not redundancies? And David, of course, after the pandemic, we had Treasury introduce Victoria's fiscal strategy. I believe we're at step 3 of 5 of that fiscal strategy, and reports are that's ticking along well. Government projects that step 4 is on track to be delivered by next financial by 2026-27, so not this financial year, but the one afterwards, and that net debt as a share of the economy will begin to decline from 26-27 as well. So, in your view, what can a public servant do? What agency do they have to assist with these cost savings that doesn't boil down to becoming redundant?
Well, that's a very difficult question for me to answer because I think there's such variation in the public service. It'll depend on a job-by-job basis. I think that there's probably a bigger issue at stake here. There is something that we do need to address. The public sector job numbers did increase by 25% since 2019. It's a very substantial increase. Of that increase, it's around about half is in health. Now, I'm not talking about the public service, I'm talking about right across the public sector. So a big chunk of that increase is in one area, health. Now, okay, right, and things post-pandemic have not settled down to anything like it. There's still a lot of illness around. Is it still at the pandemic level? Probably not, right? There probably does need to be some reprioritisation and reordering, given that we've now come through that crisis. If you don't do that, you need to up your tax base to pay for the additional services. And that's what I was hoping that we might see with the Silver Review. I'm not sure we will see it. We've seen that the health services fought an attempt at taking money away from them, and guess what? They got the money back. The budgeted savings, then they got it back. So that means other parts of the public sector are going to have to adjust. That raises bigger questions of the type that Jiselle were talking about before, because what you're going to see is if the service is taken away that people really need, they're probably not going to be very happy about that. So it's kind of in a pretty unsteady state at the moment, but I think there's probably a lot of work being done by Treasury trying to get things back in order. How do you get back in control of budgets? They've tried bringing together the health services to try and get administrative efficiencies. there may be administrative efficiencies, but I don't suspect it's going to be very many. So that's the uncomfortable reality is this big increase in the health workforce. Is that sustainable? And at the moment, quite frankly, it's not. They've budgeted $2 billion of tax increases that are due to expire in 2023-24. That means that can't continue. So that's all happening now. There's all that argy-bargy, and it's going to continue for some time, I think, until the budget surplus becomes bigger in the context of what still is a record infrastructure spend. And in the background, remember, in the background of all this, for all of us to tangle with, it's rapid population growth. All right, that's putting enormous pressure on the budget. Now, it's a federal government.
A destination for tree changes elsewhere intrastate.
Well, it's but it's international migration. Victoria is bringing in a lot of international migrants, so population growth here is very high, and it brings with it a pretty big cost to the state budget. And that's another question that hasn't been adequately dealt with at this stage.
Jiselle, coming back to you, this idea that wider organisational reprioritisation means taking the razor to lower ranking staff, lower level staff. What have you heard? Do you have any views on this?
So we haven't heard anything. And partly, I mean, I thought David's analysis was interesting, and I share his analysis about some of the kind of fanfare associated with the Silver Review that might actually be a little bit of just a bit of puff. But, you know, I also can't afford to be that optimistic, because it is our members who are being cut if our optimism isn't realised. But the point is, we don't know what's in the Silver Review. I don't think anybody does. And there is a lot of rumour mongering associated with that. But here's a couple of things I want to say about the government's strategy in relation to just how much speculation and swirl is surrounding the Silver Review right now. If David's assessment is correct, that it's just going to land and it's going to be a bit of a non-event. When we run these Clause 11s, and at times we apply for an extension of time to draft some alternative proposals, because the changes are so wide sweeping and have such wide effect, we need some proper time. You know, we haven't had 12 months to draft an alternative proposal, whereas senior executives had that amount of time. One of the arguments that they make to us about a denial of an extension of time, and we might be asking for 2 to 3 weeks, 4 weeks at most, is that the uncertainty causes anxiety and stress on the workforce. Now, we've heard about the Silver Review since May, and we're almost in November, and we still don't have any idea of what might be contained in it. That uncertainty is a really unfair political play on your workforce, particularly if it is just going to be a little bit of puff. And I say to members repeatedly, the Silver Review is going to tell us nothing new. The information that is going to have a little bit of detail in the Silver Review, it was already known in the 2025-2026 budget. So we know the job cuts are coming, and we're seeing them now, and we're calling the current suite of job cuts Silver Review by stealth. So is it going to target level 6s and below? Is it targeting VPS frontline staff, backroom staff? We don't know the answer to that. We just know that there are going to be job cuts, and we think there are multiple other ways you could do it. I mean, one way that you could actually realise budgetary savings is simply by collecting already existing taxes. They're not issuing new taxes, land taxes, enforcing those taxes. But you need a public servant to enforce the existing failure to pay in that space. So it is still a question of government priority. What is the Silver Review going to tell us? It's telling us that its target is the Victorian Public Service. Its target isn't a plethora of other ways that budgetary savings could be realised.
Yes, and one of the questions that was submitted earlier, which I guess possibly nobody on this call can answer, speaks to that sense of lack of security, which is someone saying, I'm on a 3-year contract. Does being on a 3-year contract make me a sitting duck for the silver review? And I guess what's infused in that question is concern and fear. I don't know what's going to happen to me. And I mean, the conversation about having people on rolling contracts is also a whole nother kettle of fish that we can talk about, because having someone on a contract means you're paying them at a higher rate.
Well, I do want to answer that one, because I want to say everyone's a sitting duck. I worked in the Department of Justice and Community Safety for 10 years, and I survived 4 Clause 11 processes, 4 times with about 18 months in between them. I had to go through a process of saying why my job was more important than the person sitting next to me. It is a demoralizing process. The public sector, the public service used to be some of the most stable, jobs for life kind of industries, sectors in this state, in the country. And it is now precarious. Whether you're on a contract or you're on an ongoing role, that gives you no certainty under Clause 11s. And what we're seeing right now, and over the past 4 years, with rolling Clause 11s in almost every area of the public service.
I'd like you both to contribute to thoughts on this, which is lots of what we've been talking about, from the top of the conversation when Jiselle was talking about, well, there are some frontline services which are being cut, let's not pretend otherwise, to this very moment when we're possibly weeks out from the government response to the Silver Review being published, not really knowing where exactly they're honing in on. Where does accountability sit in amidst all of this? Accountability to the public, to honestly say to them, like, this is what we're looking at and this is what we will actually trim back, to conversations about maybe mitigating public expectations. If government isn't in a position to deliver as much as it used to, maybe that's a conversation we need to be having, instead of this mealy mouthed, fewer public servants, but don't worry, all the essential services are going to be okay. How do we keep them accountable, particularly where we have a dominant Labor government and a weaker opposition? David?
Melissa, I was just thinking as Jiselle was talking, look, it's a plausible scenario is that they're delaying the silver review to flush out the opposition. And it might be that today's attack on the tax side of it, saying you're going to have $10 billion of tax cuts, that's going to make the budget $10 billion. So it's going to set things up, because the opposition has also said they're going to put in a debt cap. They're going to they've got all these policies, which mean with the tax cuts, they're going to have to make big cuts to the public service. And I wonder if that's the context they're hoping to play out, where a silver review, a more modest, reasonable silver review, is finally able to be put on the table. So it's a choice between those two scenarios, a really grim, slash and burn versus a more modest set of proposals by a government that has managed things pretty well. I could imagine that scenario playing out. It might be, Jiselle, that's why it's all being delayed. They're trying to flush the opposition out to make a silver type response more palatable. It's just as a thought.
Oh, I mean, we could speculate endlessly, and sometimes it's enjoyable and sometimes it just creates an immense anxiety, particularly for our members, and in fact non-members who are our colleagues in the Victorian Public Service. I wanted to go to your question, Melissa, about accountability and transparency, because interestingly, one of the things that the union argues in relation to where budgetary savings could be realised is in the use and reliance on contractors and consultants. Between 2018 and 2022, Victoria spent $11 billion on contractors, and then that's come down a little bit, I think. In the same period, 841 million on consultants. Now, They're talking about reducing the use of consultants and contractors, except Helen Silver and her team come from a consultancy firm. I mean, that is part of the irony of this discussion. So where is transparency and accountability when all of this work to strip the public service down has gone to contractors in the private sector who don't have the same electoral accountability and responsibility to Victorians, and what they're doing is proposing ways of cutting that public service. Now, the other idea of that is they are likely to be the beneficiaries of cuts to the public service, because a lot of those jobs, a lot of that expertise ends up flowing to the private sector anyway. I think the mere fact that the Silver review is in private hands in itself should be talked about more than it currently is. But I think the question of accountability and transparency, when so much is shifting to the private sector, which is the natural consequence of losing public sector capacity, that absolutely should be a question and a concern for Victorians. They're not as FOIable as the government is.
I mean, a great litmus test for how much appetite the government has for transparency would be, are they going to release the Silver Review recommendations at all, or just their response? And, you know, the cynical journalist in me leans to the latter. And it's interesting, right? Because some of the language used in the government's public statement about the parameters of the Silver Review uses terminology like how to right-size program expenditure. And then we have another question which illuminates the possible hypocrisy of that mission statement, which is understanding that we're all signed up to pursue budget savings and targets. How can the public and public sector challenge VPS job cuts when new infrastructure projects such as the rebuild of the Shane Warne stand at the MCG seem so low on our priority list, yet requires huge new multi-billion-dollar budget? And that seems galling in the context of terminology like right-size program expenditure, doesn't it?
I mean,
No.
my short answer to that is yes.
Yeah. So I would encourage anyone who else has questions for our guests to please share them. Someone did ask, where is Nina? I'll share with you. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it. She'd love to have been here, but a family emergency meant she couldn't participate today. One of the questions that we got when people were registering prior to the webinar starting, this is a bit left of centre, but I guess relevant in the context of delivering good services for the public. The question is, things like research and translations help us deliver more meaningful services. How can we ensure some of this, I guess, evidence-informed rigour remains when budgets are limited? Jiselle?
So I'm going to pick up on the last bit of that question, that when budgets are limited, and repeat a point I made earlier, which is, yes, budgets are limited, but the question is always priority, which comes down to politics. And it really is a function of what the government is choosing to prioritise or not. The issue of research and transit, I mean, I couldn't agree more with the person who asked the question. Those services do make services available and accessible to Victorians who don't speak English. The research function, I don't know quite what this person who asked the question was intending, but we saw in Agriculture Victoria a significant cut in research. The research that was cut was that associated with climate, with drought preparation, with a flood preparation. Like, these are critical services to Victoria. That's called a backroom. This is why we say backroom, frontline. It's not a reasonable distinction. So the question is, how do we who is the we, Victoria? How do we apply pressure to the government to make different choices in relation to budgetary expenditure? I mean, that is a broader question for civil society. That's a broader question for, you know, the roles of not just civil organisations and pressure groups, but the trade union movement, not just the CPSU, but all the public sector. How do we work together to convey collectively to the Victorian government what our collective budgetary priorities are? That is a very, very big question about social change.
Someone has asked this question, and I must say I have no background on it. Does anyone have any thoughts on Jeff Floyd's recent publication, Rethinking the Victorian Public Sector, A Blueprint for Change? In brackets, I am not Jeff. Has anyone read that on our call? No. All right. I'm sorry to the person asking that question, but I will have a look at that resource and I might write a story about it if it's any good. So someone else has asked a question, and I think it would be good to get insights from both Jiselle and David on this. This is a registrant to our webinar who's not within the Victorian jurisdiction. They're saying, I'm curious to know if you could talk about the impact of the review, what it's like for those remaining in the public service. And before we throw to our guests, I will just say to the person asking the question, in my time dealing with people in government, there is a weariness for sure. I think people do things with their eyes wide open, but there is a fatigue. And people in the public service are pragmatic. So there's probably two speeds. You either totally check out or you just sort of lean into the discomfort and approach it pragmatically. Jiselle?
I mean, I will say that the Victorian public service versus sector, I mean, that's still, in terms of departmental staff, that's still around 54,000 workers in relation to statutory authorities, agencies, and the other pieces. We're still looking at around 100,000 people. That's a lot of people. I think the biggest issue in relation to the effects of the cuts, I mean, put the silver review aside because we haven't seen it, I think the biggest emerging issue is workload. You can't get rid of that number of staff for that number of years and not have and for there not to be a consequence on those remaining. You know, when we were you know, just in the course of our work speaking with housing officers, now I appreciate their front line, but housing officers are managing anywhere between 300, 400, 500 properties each. The people in public housing are some of the most vulnerable Victorians in the state. That is a huge workload. In some cases, we heard figures up to 800 properties per housing officer. That's the workload. You know, these are people that care deeply about Victoria. They care deeply about the welfare of the people that they're interacting with. Child protection workers who at times get called out at 4 o'clock to support a young person and they're not home before midnight. That's not work that's compensated. Those aren't hours that are necessarily compensated. And those workers get up every day and repeat. And their workloads, which, as I said, is the current emerging issue facing the public service as we work through all of these cuts. It is absolutely unsustainable, and Victoria will be worse off. You know that the Working with Children check section had undergone 2 Clause 11s before we had the major crisis which was actually a function of government policy, and members were simply executing public policy. But you can't decimate a business unit and then expect that not to have real consequences for Victorians. That is the message that needs to get out there. It needs to be absolutely untenable for not just Labor governments, but all Victorian governments to cut public sector jobs. We keep the state running.
David, I I want to pick up on what Jiselle said about getting the message out there. You made a reference earlier in your remarks about some of the reporting on the state of Victoria's economy by the AFR. I have to say, I'm not so sure the Fourth Estate is doing a really good job at being the bridge to translating what's really going on to the community. In your time observing government and public policy, what have your observations been about civics education, expectation for government matching what's actually really happening?
I think that the biggest change without a doubt is the decline of the mainstream press as an influence on people's understanding of Victorian politics. So the decline of the Herald Sun is particularly noticeable. They've run a full-scale, clearly in your yard opposition praise for the last umpteen elections, and they've been very unsuccessful. The previous Premier was very successful of having a strong social media presence with a following that probably exceeded the Herald Sun. So the decline of the mainstream press, the rise of social media, and that makes it much more volatile because people are getting their information quite often from unreliable sources. To backpedal a bit to the question that you asked around, could a populist sort of Trumpian Dodge type scenario emerge? It could. Would it be big? I doubt it, but it could get a significant minority behind it. There is a kind of you can see that right-wing social media based movement here. You can see it with the protests we're having on the steps of Parliament, the anti-migration lot. So there's a kernel of it, and that's what also makes this all a little bit volatile, with the two parties not really performing very well. You've got an opening for a more extreme right-wing approach. That's what worries me greatly, particularly with all the press around the crime, law and order stuff. It's a potent combination, Melissa, that you could see something like that coming along and fermenting and being quite unhelpful, and without the capacity to control it as it sort of lurches more and more out of control. I've never known Victoria to be like this, the kind of demonstrations that we're seeing regularly. It's as if something shifted during the pandemic and we don't quite know how to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. Well, prior to joining the Mandarin, I was working in child justice in Victoria. So I understand how difficult it can be to contend with populist narratives and do the right thing in the best interests of those children. Final question for you both. I think this concept neatly wraps a bow around a lot of what we've been discussing. So it's this idea of good government services. How can the government assure itself it's delivering good services? How can the public service assure itself that despite all this impost, it can also deliver for the citizen? And how do citizens know? I mean, we have things like ROGS reports, which come out annually. We can look at things like the state budget every year and track investment and spending. But if we can't rely on the Fourth Estate to do that as well as it used to, what are we sort of left with to gauge how well government is performing and that we're okay? David and then Jiselle?
I think the most important single thing is lived experience. So when people experience a teacher, a police person, or whatever it is, that their experience is a really positive one. And I think by and large it is. The trouble is this one of the messages that can come out either through social media or the mainstream media about this abstract other thing that involves great waste. That's the sort of agenda that's prosecuted by the Herald Sun without much foundation. I think it's that we, as I said before, the reason why it's sort of open now is because of this big growth in health. That means that the budget needs to be trimmed elsewhere where it probably shouldn't be, because they're not willing to tackle that health issue, and it makes it all a lot more uncertain. It's really clear looking at the Auditor General's report on the government savings arising from the 23-24 budget response to pandemic, that they really didn't implement it that carefully. The savings are being delivered, but it's pretty blunt, right? So it's just, here's your annual budget. It's been trimmed by this amount. Make sure you meet that or your job's on the line, secretary. Did they follow frontline, backline? They weren't interested in that. They just had to meet the budget. So it's quite blunt. But that can lead then to people feeling frontline services are not very good because the person wasn't there when they wanted them to be. It's quite it's a blunt, messy way of delivering the changes. I wish that this had been done much more sensibly and in a more considered and constructive way. The messaging this time hasn't been very good. It's been around, cuts and savings. It would have been much better to have talked about and focused on reorganising to deliver better services, probably picking up Jiselle's point. It hasn't been done. We are where we are, and it's all rather messy and uncertain, unfortunately.
I agree with the points that David made. And to add to it, I would say that what is also required is a deep and ideological commitment to transparency and integrity, and actually develop principled public policy. And you can't do that when what's motivating you is kind of the next election and the next election cycle. And when you're making decisions, I'm going to use a very potent word, based on nepotism and things like that. I think it requires evidence base. I'll give you a wild example. This idea of like the little anglers in regional Victoria providing free fishing rods to kids in schools. Like we were told anecdotally by people in the regions, by the fisheries officers, that most of these rods ended up in the waterways. Kids didn't want them. They weren't using them. The idea of getting kids out into the great outdoors, great idea, but you don't achieve that by giving them rods. So what has the state government done? Offered another 82,000 free fishing rods to school kids. There's no evidence backing some of these seemingly populist decisions, and it requires that. But it requires a deep commitment to transparency, integrity, making public policy based on evidence, and being deeply principled and defending those positions, making the political arguments, attempting to win a political argument in the public psyche, rather than following, and that goes to the conversation earlier about the fourth estate, just chasing what's popular and chasing votes. So I would add to the things that David said, that other piece.
We promised a wide-ranging discussion, and I think we've definitely delivered on that. I'd probably conclude by saying that there has been something frustrating about our conversation, which is that, to some extent, we're kind of intellectually bush bashing, and as you point out, we're grasping for the things we know. But there are known unknowns somewhere out there, which we are hoping will emerge, that people like me will keep trying to dig for, and people like Jiselle as well, that watchers like David will be able to observe closely and contextualize in a sort of longitudinal fashion, which I think is also very helpful, rather than just following the news of the day per se. Thank you both so much for joining me. To all the Victorian public servants who've tuned in, thank you for coming and listening. To those further afield, thank you also. Public service delivering for government is hard. That's one truth that I know in the work that I do, but we are committed to sort of exploring the nuance of that endeavour, and I'm sure everyone here will be in agreement that it's a very worthwhile mission. So thank you, everyone. Go well.
Thank you.